Hello and welcome to True Love, No Shame, a podcast on recovering from Christian purity culture. I'm Danny Fankhauser, author of Shameless, How I Lost My Virginity and Kept My Faith. You can learn more about my book at shamelessthebook.com. I'm here today with Jamie DeWolf, founder of Tourette's Without Regrets, an underground performance art show in Oakland. So, Jamie, I'm so excited to have you here. I'm such a big fan of the show, which you've had it going for, 10 years now?
Whoosh, longer than that. We had just celebrated our 15-year anniversary.
Oh, 15. Oh.
Yeah, it's a little muddier than that. It kind of depends on where we started, but I really started it like 1999. So I've been doing some kind of crazy incarnation forever, I feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and you do some other, and you do some documentary stuff. You do other creative stuff around Oakland as well.
Yeah, so I'm a filmmaker, storyteller. I do slam poetry myself, and I'm performing at the Snap Judgment Live at the Paramount Theater tomorrow. I do a lot of films for You Speaks, do different music videos, short films, all the crazy stuff. So just keep it cracking.
Yeah. Yeah. And my friend just told me about Tourette's. I think the first one I went to was over this past summer. And it's so hard to describe to people what it is. I always kind of say, well, it's a variety show. And so there's usually some burlesque, there's usually some sort of aerial, there's, sometimes magic. Does that sound about what you would say the theme is, or how do you usually describe it to people?
The theme of Tourette's?
Yeah.
It's alternatively been described as the island of misfit toys, the fun house for fanatics, the Fight Club of underground art. I mean, I kind of view it as really just the oldest form of variety show that there is, which is like vaudeville in a very contemporary Oakland edge. So, I mean, we have everything from circus to comedy to burlesque to battle rap to beatboxers, breakdancers, aerial performers, slam poets, dirty haiku bouts, crazy audience contests, and all of that. I mean, it's really like where highbrow art and lowbrow smash together in one demolition derby.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the haiku battle is the perfect example of that. I've never seen that anywhere else.
Well, I didn't invent that. That was actually from the National Slam. They had a haiku battle, and I just thought it was hilarious as a way to start a show. So we really slanted it towards the dirty haiku battle. And what's awesome about it is that even if they suck, it's over quickly. And the perfect structure to kind of warm up the crowd in terms of where the show is going. And it's changed over time, but I mean, the dirty haiku bout has pretty much always been a staple because it really gets people sort of warmed up on the fact that, you're going to hear, quote, offensive language. But I think some of it is also even just challenging the idea of what is offensive? Why stop at just calling something offensive? Actually, we had to change one of our opening rules to the show. One of the rules says be offended. And as I tell the audience is that I hope you're offended by something, because to be offended is actually the start of a conversation, not the end of it. You know what I mean? It's the way that people even reflect on bad words or bad language. As someone who grew up Christian in particular, is that I've been really obsessed with why are these words even bad? They're pretty much all references to bodily functions, bodily fluids, etc. There's a real renunciation of the flesh. And I think that is carried through all of our language and a lot of the way that we interact about what's offensive. So the dirty haiku bout is kind of a fun way to just sort of open that up.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thought. I know, I didn't use swear words growing up, and I still feel weird when I do, just because it was such a thing that I wasn't supposed to do. It's funny.
I remember the day that I said my first cuss word, and it was in the 6th grade. It took me to say a single cuss word, and it was a real peeling off of the Band-Aid type experience. So
yeah,
and obviously that sort of opened the floodgates. Then I just cussed like a sailor ever since.
Well, I like that you mentioned the offensive rule, because the first time I heard of the event, I was like, isn't Tourette's a condition? Is it it kind of politically incorrect to call something the name of this? So I'm curious, where did the name come from?
The name actually came from me getting kicked out of every open mic because of language in particular.
Okay.
I was a really, really suicidal young man, and I was actually coming through this incredibly, just totally abysmal low point in my life. And I was basically writing these incredibly incendiary and vulnerable pieces about trying to survive through this kind of suicidal period. And people would kick me out because I had bad words in it. And that was so infuriating to me that all of this like exorcism that I was trying to do, and all that, which, you know, in retrospect was absolutely selfish to sort of purge onto an audience, but I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know where else to go. I didn't really have any venues or outlets. And so show after show, these were tiny little open mics, but they would kick me out. And there's a sense that I had of that these mics aren't really open, you know, that people don't want to hear the full range of emotion. And especially if it gets into kind of dangerous territory for this kind of really quiet teacup culture. And so that was how I started the show, was basically the anything goes open mic where, you know, all kinds of expression were allowed and encouraged, because I just saw that there was this real lack of intersection from poetry to comedy and hip hop and theater and a lot of other worlds that I loved. And that poetry just seemed really, really behind, that there was this aspect of that this is a much more genteel, sort of safer form of expression. And I resented that with every fiber of my being. So I started Tourette's to basically celebrate all different kinds of expression and everything from MCs to songwriters to comedians, and really just, it kind of started with verbal expression as sort of a base, and then that quickly blew up into taking on all different kinds of performance that are relatively stripped down. I mean, we don't really book bands. We pretty much book folks that it's really just them and their body and their mouth. That's it. I mean, whether they're burlesque or a circus performer or whatever, I mean, there's really not a lot of magic involved in terms of what they're bringing to the stage. There's not a lot of electronics or, you know, anything else. It's very much a showcase that we've had shows that have had to move to a parking lot, and a lot of times we can still pull it off. So it just really depends.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really shows in terms of like when you go to the show, you just feel like everyone is welcome, you know, probably because of that. And I think that's really interesting. I used to go to this church in New York that met in a bar, and it was kind of like, the idea was, you know, it's a bar. It's like, you didn't do like your typical worship music. It was just kind of like the speaker. And for some reason, I almost felt like too put together to be there, because everyone was kind of like, you're like a misfit for church. But then like I found myself kind of like dressing down to go to it. And so it's kind of strange, like how I didn't feel welcome in that environment. But I think kind of what you're saying is like, it is truly like open, and like based on the type of performances, it feels like a safe space for everyone.
And it's actually based off church. I mean, the opening of the show is ostensibly really exactly like church. I mean,
it is. As a long-time church
strangers, you know, I mean, to hug someone that you don't know and try to just encourage a sense of community of like, no matter how crazy this is, that we're all in the same room. We're all going to go through this experience together, and then also lay down hard ground rules in terms of what we expect. And, you know, some of those are literally about respecting the performers, respecting consent, and then also being a part of it and giving love to all the performers that go on stage. And that, you know, if you just take different sound bites from our show, people might think it's the most rowdy, raucous show on earth. But actually, I mean, it has those moments, certainly. But I mean, like, we don't have fights in the audience. We never had a shooting, and doing a show in downtown Oakland for over 10 years without having any kind of fight or altercation like that. I credit a lot of that to the environment that we really insist on creating at the beginning of the show. And I find that people who haven't been in that kind of environment, they might even be uncomfortable with it because it feels like it's in a world that they don't quite understand. But I mean, once the show gets going, I think that they really get it. That like, this is really a celebratory show. It's even in being, quote, offensive in certain realms, it's really being celebratory. It's being, you know, celebrating humor and expression and bodies, and being queer and weird and mutants and just being strange and doing your thing. And, I mean, it really relies on that old comedy rule of punching up, you know what I mean? So there's that element as well. But a lot of it is, yeah, based off church. I mean, at the end of the show, I stand there and I shake everybody's hand as they walk out. And that was just like every pastor when I was a kid.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I've been to a lot of church services, have given a lot of like awkward handshakes. And yeah, like I got an actual like warm, tight hug from like a stranger at Tourette's, like it's very, like church done right.
Yeah. I mean, we do have a little more of an undercurrent of some of Oakland's velvet wrap fist. I mean, sometimes you have to give him rules that you really wish you didn't even have to say out loud. But there was a show, I think it was like 3-4 months ago, that we've been doing the opening hug for Hug a Stranger for years. And someone just grabbed this girl's boobs who was part of the Tourette's. I don't know what the language is like on your show, so I feel really absurd. Boobs, but
it's
crack that breast. They grabbed her breasts right in the very start of the show. She ended up socking two guys. They both he socked both of them in the face. They were kicked out of the show immediately, and then we had to add a new rule to every show after that, which is ask first. I was just like, you don't know these people. Like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? But I'm just like, and it's a little sad that you feel like you have to even state that. But clearly, from the culture we live in, and especially what's happened these days, it's some people you need to make it as extreme as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to get back to the consent thing, but first, so you grew up in evangelical church, right?
Yeah. Me and my mom kind of quibble as to which one had the most impact, but it varied from sort of Baptist to Pentecostal to, I'm not sure what. She would kind of go from church to church looking for a spot. And I really, really internalized all of Christianity at a very young age and was very, very impressional and passionate about it. And for many years, I wanted to be a minister myself. And I was a classic archetypal devoted Christian kid. I mean, I would literally, tithe some of my allowance and send it to missionaries who were working with cannibals in the Congo. I was particularly obsessed with that for a while and trying to get letters back from them and making sure they didn't get eaten. I just absolutely would try to minister to kids on the playground and read the Bible studiously and really talked to Jesus as my invisible friend really all the way up until the 7th grade. So, I mean, it was really hardwired into me. And some of that is, I just think maybe is the way I was built. My brother, who's a year and a half younger than me, he went to the same churches and it never had that same kind of an impact. He went to Sunday school and he knew the stories and all that, but I don't think he was walking around talking to Jesus every day, when he's out playing on the tire swing. So for me, it was a very, very I was very devoted, and to a point where when I started asking harder questions, I was asking from a Christian perspective and I was not understanding the answers that I was being given. And it was past logic and really past faith. I mean, just some of it just fundamentally didn't seem fair or fair from a God that I would want to give my life to. So.
Yeah. For me, it was similar. It was more in college, but yeah, it was kind of out of like enthusiasm about faith and learning more about it that like I kind of started to uncover stuff that just didn't make sense.
Right. Right. Yeah. And then that's when you start to get into the take it and leave it style of Christianity, which I frankly just don't really accept. I mean, I have a big problem with Christians who like to sort of soft pedal how utterly homophobic and misogynistic the Bible is at its root. And that I think that Christianity is a very convenient sort of good cop, bad cop on if you want to condemn homosexuals, you get to quote the Old Testament. You want to say that we should ask for forgiveness for the latest minister caught in a hotel room with a male prostitute, then let's go the Jesus route, start talking about forgiveness. And so there's a real inherent contradiction to a lot of it. But I think also it's the duality of it that has, for the most part, that's what I've really been adamant about kind of removing from my mental state. And I think that so much of America is really rooted in that sort of black and white absolutist way of thinking that I've endeavored every day since to really remove that and to stop thinking in terms of good and evil. You know what I mean? That I don't believe that that's the way the universe works. You know what I mean? That it's usually not just as simple as predator or prey. I mean, nearly everything is both predatory and prey and devours something else to survive, you know, on and on. And this idea that there's only one way you can go, either heaven or hell, or you're a saint or a sinner, and that there's no in between, I think is a really kind of disturbing pathology. And I think causes a lot of just a real schizophrenic mindset in the American,
Mm-hmm.
and especially that way when it
Yeah.
comes to sexuality. Of course, it's like it's just literally one or the other. You know what I mean? And I think that's incredibly destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to kind of like reading the Bible literally, and people get abstinence from verses, but it's also a book that was written in a really patriarchal culture where women were seen as property. And like, that's why they're describing it in that way, because a woman was like a piece of property that went from like her father to her husband.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that when you really go back and look at the formation of the Bible, if a Christian is allowed to accept for just an hour that perhaps a divine being in the sky did not ghostwrite every single word of this book that has also been translated a myriad of times by many, many powerful white men. But if we perchance entertain the idea that the Bible is really a historical mixtape in some degree, and you look at the Nicene Council, you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you look at when the Gnostics were still writing their own chapters and their different apostles that weren't accepted. The larger truth that I've read over and over and been really obsessed about is that there actually was a very strong aspect of femininity as divinity early on, and it was really just pushed out. I mean, it was written out, and that to me is something that is pretty disturbing and is unforgivable in my eyes, in terms of, you know, there is the Mother Mary and the Virgin Mary and whatnot, is like, she's actually still not on the same level as God. And some people, you can't worship her in the same way in many different branches of Christianity. You can respect her, you know, she's great. Thanks for being here, Mary. But like, you're not allowed to actually worship her in any real way. And to take away that duality of masculinity and femininity on purpose is a testament to it as a controlling patriarchal device. And that's what I think is dangerous about it. And if you look back in Dead Sea Scrolls, if you look back at the Nicene Council, there are many different factions and sects that wanted and worshiped the Virgin Mary as a character that was really on the same level as this sort of divine heavenly father. You had a heavenly mother as well, and they're like, nope, we ain't doing that. And yeah. I mean, just the way that even Eve is blamed for the apple in the Garden of Eden, and I was just like, really? I was like, you think if there was a forbidden fruit that the woman would be the one that would screw that up? Like, I just think in our guts, there's a fair amount of that just feels utterly absurd. I'm like, nah, that's definitely a man thing. You're like, hey, you're all good forever. Okay. This is paradise. This is literally paradise. Don't fuck this up. Just don't eat that one apple. I'm pretty sure it was the guy who was like, I'm going to eat that shit. I'm eating that. Come on. What's the big deal? I'm eating it. You know?
Totally.
Doomed forever, for all time.
So what did your parents tell you about sex, or what was kind of like your education growing up?
Sadly, yeah, and this is like a psychological field day, is I don't recall ever really getting a good talk. I was really raised by a single mom, and I discovered this storehouse, this like massive pile of hardcore pornography in the dumpster. And I was so confused by what I was seeing that I remember vividly my sexual consciousness thought that women had that the vaginas that I were seeing were actually surgically removed penises, and that was the hole that was left. That was all I understood about it. And I didn't know why anybody would want to subject themselves to that. I didn't understand what the interactions were, but I remember being really feverishly obsessed with trying to understand this, but not feeling I could have any sort of safe place or time to ask my mom. That was an incredibly fearful thing. And I understood that this porn was like plutonium, and I had to hide it in the woods, and, would run out and study it, and just didn't understand the reaction I was having to seeing it, and trying to understand it. And it was only when my mom got remarried that she sat us down in like an IHOP. they just they
Uh-huh.
decided that was
A
the
public
time,
place.
and they were like, because they had gotten married, and there was a couple times that I would, hear sounds coming from the bedroom, and I would freak out, and I would run and knock and ask on the door, and like I thought my mom was being hurt, and she's like, "Honey, I'm fine, I'm doing great," and and so I didn't,
Mhm.
I had like a fundamental abyss in terms of understanding what any of this was. And I, you know, I remember asking her even just stupid shit like, like, so what is a blow job? Do they blow on your penis, and what is that for? And she's like, no, they don't exactly blow on it, but I had a profoundly undeveloped sexual consciousness for a long time. And, that was like kind of kept from me. I didn't really have a lot of people from church I could ask about. And it was really sort of a slow growing kind of sense. And then like a lot of kids would find out more from, kids at school, and then like the porn mag that would get handed around, and then just trying to understand it. And I think a lot of kids didn't understand what the hell we were looking at, but there's always the kids that want to act like they know it all, and are telling you completely insane information. They're just making up, but because nobody wants to admit that they don't know anything, and it takes a while.
Mhm.
I mean, in these days of the internet, I have no understanding of how kids' consciousness is impacted by internet porn and its accessibility at such an early age.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my parents just kind of skipped over it, and I guess hoped I would figure it out somewhere else. So we never had any kind of sex talk. Um, and I actually only found out that I had a clitoris when I was like in my early 20s. So that was a fun
Oh,
time. But actually, like that's one thing I've noticed about purity culture is I know that like I went to, at church services, like they would talk about like here's how to tell your boyfriend that you can't have sex, and like that you should wait till you're married, and like if your boyfriend loves you he'll wait, and described men as like they'll say anything to have sex, basically, which is a very sad description of men, which actually kind of like leaves out the entire concept of consent if like they're presenting it in sort of this like men will trick you in order to
well,
have
yeah,
sex.
it really comes down to that whole general concept of the devil is always using sex as sort of your weakest link of temptation. And it also is making virginity itself like a coveted sort of, sacred little magical ball that you have to like hold and clutch onto as long as you can, and that everyone's going to take it. And I think that there's some virtues to that. I mean, I think that there's an aspect of of watching out for predatory men, that that this is something that you need to retain as long as you can. I can understand the base of that. I mean, I think that there's some good instincts in some aspects of Christianity, but I mean, I don't agree with it in its application. I think that viewing sex as such a dangerous battlefield and putting it in people's mind is it's the entire concept of Christianity is basically that your flesh and body are basically a puppet, and that you're puppets on a stage, and that there's Satan and there's God on, they're both in the audience, and Satan's the one with the megaphone yelling and heckling you, trying to make you fuck up. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what you do on the stage as long as you accept, Lord Jesus Christ in your heart, you ask for forgiveness. So that's one. So you have this sort of sweet moral out for any of your actual actions, but also that there's just that the world and earth is really just morality play. I mean, it's that it's like a video game, and you have to pick how you're going to live or survive, because the only life that really matters is the one after death, which is a very convenient spiritual carrot on the stick, and so that's something that I've always had an issue with, is that it can become an element of control. And I think that when it comes to virginity and sexuality, that's a huge element of it as well. I mean, I think that there's all aspects of these kinds of morality that started as forms of control, in terms of just trying to keep people in line. You know what I mean? Of like, you can't do this, don't do that. This is a really bad idea. We'd really appreciate it if, you don't steal and burn and kill and, et cetera. So, but I really don't think that you've ever needed the Bible to tell people that. I mean, it's always trotted out as like, well, what about the good things in the Bible? I mean, like, I really pretty sure about every village that gets together, they kind of agree in a few basics, and they're pretty much always centralized around some of those basics. So.
Right. Like it makes sense. Like back before there was birth control or protection, it was a good idea to not sleep with a lot of people. But yeah, it's sort of like, is this still a moral standard now that we have access to
Right.
these other
And
things?
to be choosy, which I think is fair. I mean, like I have a daughter myself, and I'm certainly not going to encourage her to be a virgin until marriage. And I won't lie, I turn into an utter coward in terms of talking to her about sexuality. I mean, I'm real. She's 18 now and she's had boyfriends and stuff, but like, her mom is a much more valiant soldier in that era. I mean, like me and my daughter we've talked about sex, but like I just don't want to ask too many questions. I don't want to be invasive of her privacy. I say kind of the typical dad things like if any man treats you wrong, like I'm gonna beat the shit out of him. I mean, I say all that kind of gruff dad stuff, but I mean, when it comes to her own sexuality, I mean, I think to some degree that isn't my business if she's doing it with with people who respect her and it's obviously consent and everything else. But I mean, I think there's a certain level of like it's not mine to control. So I mean, that's the issue though, is that where does this verge from some sense of communal standards for just like recommendations and then absolutes? You know what I mean? And the instances of well, and also what's even more dangerous in stuff like the Bible is the sexually empowered woman. So that is a very different category. I mean, like I think when it comes to the virginity, we can argue that maybe there's some positive attributes, but ultimately it should be the woman's choice, of course. But when it comes to sexually empowered women, and you see this over and over in American society, is there's this sort of fascination slash condemnation at the same time, because I think it's terrifying to people try to regulate that kind of sexuality. A woman who's just like, I'm gonna fuck who I want, and that's that. You know what I mean? It's usually the first one that they try to tie to the cross and light. So.
Yeah. So let's get back to consent and how that's rule at Tourette's. So I found that so interesting because I know I've had countless experiences where like I'm in a crowded bar and someone, like even something small, like someone walks by and they'll like cup their hand on my waist as they like walk by. And it's like, you could put your hand on my shoulder, and it's like, it's so fast and so small that it's like, it feels strange. Like I've never had the guts to actually be like, hey, don't do that. Because I feel like they would just be like, oh, I was just walking, So, but I think that's why it struck me so much when you like opened with that as a rule, because it was like, oh, well, finally I'm like allowed to be like, hey, like that's crossing the line, like don't touch me.
It's just, the thing is too, is that before any man starts defending of like, oh, what, I can't be flirtatious. Like, let's be really clear that this is almost like 99% is from some fucking dirtbag that you don't even know. You know what I mean? It's a guy you don't know, you haven't talked to, some guy who just thinks he's some fucking magical Don Juan or something in his own mind. And yeah, these dirtbags just exist. And I mean, it's just so unnecessary. And I mean, to me on an even harder edge level, I mean, I was molested when I was a kid. Every girlfriend I've had, pretty much except for two, but literally every single one of them have all been molested, and many of them violently raped. I mean, rape is epidemic. And I mean, to me, it's stunning that so much of America is waking up to that. You know what I mean? It's that everywhere and everywhere that I've seen ever since I was really just a young teenager and found out what had happened to me and found out what had happened to all my friends and what was still going on and so forth. So yeah, some guys just really need some sort of extreme slap in the face to just be like, this isn't all right. You know what I mean? Like you can flirt with someone without making them feel profoundly uncomfortable. And I think in general is this sort of sense that men are kind of like working magic or like trying to seduce women, I think is just kind of generally bullshit. I view that it's like I view that women generally have decided a long time ago if you have any chance or at all once you start even opening your mouth, and really that you're what you should be doing is trying not to fuck that up. If they decided like, all right, I might go some, hang out with you or whatever, is that like you're kind of starting from a good spot. I would hope. I don't know. I mean, it's just that any of these touchy feely guys that are in that manner, especially to strangers, all the girls who go crowd surfing and some guy grabs him and just, yeah. I mean, I just really want to sock them all in the face. I just don't. Sometimes I've never had that instinct to just like grab strangers like that. Um, but I was also worked in a really like kind of highly sexualized performance community where lines can get blurry. There's a lot of like, I mean, there's just a lot of backstage shenanigans. But I think that a lot of people have to learn early on is that there's a lot of lines that you just can't cross. You can't make people feel uncomfortable backstage. If someone's getting a dress, look at them, you know what I mean? And all that. I mean, and also just don't touch people you don't fucking know. I mean, I feel like a lot of these conversations are super simplified. If you ask a homophobic guy and you're like, okay, so you're super homophobic, and they're like, yeah, super homophobe. And you're like, great. I hope that works out for you. So imagine if I walked up and I grazed you with my hand or cupped your ass or something like that. Would you want to turn around and punch me in the face? If the answer is yes, and you're doing that kind of action to a woman, then yes, you are absolutely 100% in the wrong. And I feel some of these
Yeah.
guys should probably get punched in the face. I mean, I think that we're at a huge turning point in society, which I think is gratifying to see, is that it's okay for men to be scared that they're not going to get away with some dumb shit. That's oftentimes to some men that's really the only thing that's going to correct that behavior. That's why we have law enforcement. That's why we have jail sentences. But I mean, now it's going to be pretty extreme for a while. But I'm glad that we've already had rules in place like that for a while at Tourette's, because when the show was smaller, when we were starting out, the stuff wasn't really much of an issue because a lot of people kind of knew each other in some way or another. They're apart from, different communities and sort of coming together. But when your crowd gets up to like, 500, 800, 900 people, some people and dirtbags try to really use the anonymity of a crowd, or they just don't seem to get like what kind of world they're in. And so some of those rules, as extreme as they are, um, I mean, are really just letting people know like that is not that world. You know what I mean? We are not at a club dance floor. This is not a fucking Super Bowl party. This is not, a high school locker room. This is none of that, none of those things. And also, I mean, there's a lot of burlesque performers and circus performers and all that who are wearing all kinds of awesome, fabulous outfits. You know what I mean? And they don't need grabbed or anything else. And that can happen. I mean, I've been in clown troupes where, I mean, we're all literally dressed as crazy clowns and, admittedly risque clowns, sure. But, one of the jobs that we would do is like walk around, and there was a friend of mine who was, 5 feet tall, and she had on this kind of like shorts where like, she like was wearing this like little dress and all these stripes and all of this clown stuff. And even women would just come up for like a picture and just like spank her on the ass super hard. And it was completely out of nowhere. You didn't know why it was even happening. It was even coming from other women. There was no way that she provoked it or they asked or anything like that. And she almost got in a couple fist fights as a clown because people are just like, you're just like, they're not a cartoon character. You know what I mean? Like they're just like you. And it's the same as if someone dresses up and is going out, like they didn't dress up for you. You know what I mean? They dressed up, um, hopefully for really just one for themselves and to feel in charge of themselves and to feel strong and feel sexy and flamboyant, or maybe their date or a friend or whatever, but they sure as fuck did not dress like that for the sleaze bag at the bar. You know what I mean? So, uh, yeah, I mean, some of them you're just like, God damn, man, you haven't learned this shit yet. You know, I mean, like, look, everyone is on a different learning curve, but, and there's also just kind of, there's predators in every community, no matter how benevolent. And so, that's just the nature of it. And so I think that once you kind of really are very clear and upfront about those sort of boundaries, then you really kind of establish of like, all right, like this is, yeah, we're not going to be gray area about this. Like if someone does this to you, the host of the show is encouraging for you to start fucking them up in the audience, and that's that. And I'm like, you've been warned. It's not like we're not gonna like discuss this. It's not gonna be a court thing. It's just like if you don't know someone and you grab their ass, like they are completely encouraged to turn around and sock you in the face. You know what I mean? And in contrast, I haven't had many men who just got socked in the face for no reason. Really, no one has gotten socked in the face since that incident. Thank God. And just sometimes shit like that can happen. I mean, also, people get sloppy. They get drunk. I've been a bartender for a while. I've had women, jump on me and grab me all over. And like, my girlfriend's there and they're like grabbing me and like trying to lick my ear. And you know what I mean? Like, so there's a certain degree where you're like, no, you know what I mean? You gotta be firm. So
totally. Yeah, and I think it applies on dates too. And like just thinking of the audience of this podcast in terms of like people like me who might have started having sex later in life, like what would you say is the etiquette around either initiating sex or declining it, in terms of like just being really clear that everyone involved has consent?
Boy, that's a good question because of what's going on these days, right? In terms of, I mean, one, I think everybody should be careful to never put themselves in a position where they don't feel safe. So, I mean, if you have any doubt, just don't even go in someone's bedroom. You don't even go to their house. You know what I mean? If you have to, I mean, if you have glimmer of doubt, I mean, sometimes that's not enough, but I mean, I think it's probably best to just like the moment that some people think, all right, I got consent, like, it's time to go. I think you should just keep going in terms of beats of really establishing like way beyond a shadow of doubt that consent is absolute. You know what I mean? That it's that you are both in agreement. This is both something you want to do, and also that you're in a good state to do it. You know, I've certainly have left houses where girls were super intoxicated, and I was like, no, this is not what we should do. You know what I mean? It doesn't make me heroic or anything else. It's just something you shouldn't do. I don't want to have that kind of sex. You know what I mean? And I think that when it comes to consent, I think that this generation in particular, the younger generation who are really watching a lot of these dynamics change for the better is, it's like, how do you be as clear as possible, early on? And having a lot of friends who are in the polyamory community and so forth is what's I've learned a lot from them is they discuss things a lot. You know what I mean? They have to be very articulate about where they're at, what they're looking for, what they want, what they don't want, in terms of just their relationship dynamics. And I think people can learn a lot from that. I think that we have so much kind of fear and reluctance to talk about sex in general that I think that it's just at some point, if you're going to have the sex, I think you got to have a conversation about it first, you know, and hopefully that those things can become less awkward, moving forward. Sometimes they can happen early on, but I mean, you see over and over on dating sites and stuff, someone's on Tinder or whatever, and they're like, "Hey, hi, how are you?" And they're like, "I'm good, just making dinner." Dick pic sent immediately. And you're like, where the hell did that come from? Like, just going from 0 to 90 right away. And I think that, you know, people need to feel safe. They need to feel clear. And that sex should not be the part that you fuck up. You know what I mean? That should be a part that everybody's excited to do. Let's do it. This is great. And, the relationship that should be the thing you fuck up. that that has its own issues down the line, but consent should never be something of confusion. It should never be ambiguous. And I think that if someone feels ambiguous on either way, you know what I mean? If a girl is drunk and she's like, "Come on over," and you feel like she might not remember it the next day, then you should leave. You know what I mean? And you say, "Look, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it another time," and that's fine. I mean, that's what should happen. And, I think that there's even discussions now on just kind of drunken consent, period. And, someone's been a bartender and has served a million alcoholics, and so forth. I'm sure there's a lot of people, including myself, who woke up and be like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that happened." Where I'm even surprised, in aspects like that. I mean, I've woke up and women were having sex with me like when I was passed out. So I mean, there's differing layers, of consent. And I mean, that was awful. That was really humiliating to me, and, the whole nine. And so I think that in general, it's really about negotiation. I mean, it's like, if you can't negotiate, in a safe way that makes both people feel, safe moving forward, then you shouldn't be having sex. You know what I mean? Because it's not going to get better from there. I mean, like, you should be at that level of communication if you're going to go all the way, And so I think that is what's important about sex education and everything else, is to not have so much shame, attributed to it. I mean, we have so much shame in discussing our sexuality, talking about masturbation, talking about fantasy, talking about, what we want and what we kind of desire, and even some of our past experiences. There's so much shame about that I think that shame and that secrecy actually can manifest itself in incredibly destructive and dangerous ways. I think that people who are able to express themselves sexually in a healthy and upfront way are going to be better partners. You're just going to have a healthier and saner time, and so I think I mean, one reason why I would never advocate virginity before marriage is, to me, it blows my mind that there's been centuries of people getting married to people, and then, if you don't have sex before marriage, and then you find out on the wedding night that maybe sexually you're not that compatible. That's crazy to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, if I'm
Right.
gonna make a lifelong union with someone, I think the sexual arena is a pretty fair one to hope that you guys are kind of on the same page. You know what I mean? Like, kind of in the same realm.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's just like out of enthusiasm for marriage as like a lifelong commitment, you actually want
right.
the
And it's
marriage
like,
to
it's
work.
not about,
And
marriage is not a business. It's not an investment. It's supposed to be like a a lifelong narrative, I mean, and so if you want your partner in all things, I mean, I think if you over and over read what breaks, couples apart, it's just like, so often it's like, arenas like money and sex, and just these arenas that we're really uncomfortable with. And if you kind of can't be honest about early on, you're going to have massive problems down the road. You know what I mean? So I mean, I think in general is like, the more honest and upfront that you can be, to your partner, the better your chances are going to be, period, because people know what they're signing up for. There's nothing more bewildering when you are starting a relationship and you realize, like, holy shit, I thought this was a love movie and this is actually going to be a action adventure horror comedy. I didn't realize that. I didn't know this is what movie I was watching. All right. When does it end? So
yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jamie. And thank you all for joining us for True Love, No Shame. If you can make it to Oakland on the first Thursday of a month, be sure to come to Tourette's. I promise you won't be disappointed.
Thank you.
We'll be back soon with more.